Perfect. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share with you some of the books and articles that have caught my attention over the last week, week and a half or so. And then I'm going to turn it over to all those of you who are here to share anything that you've been either thinking about, reading about, hoping to read about, whether it be on your computer screen, on your nightstand, or just things you've heard about that are of high levels of interest to you. So let me just make sure that I've got everything up to share with you all. Okay, so bear with me as I pull it up. There we go. So this week I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time in my house. My kids are both still young. I have an almost 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, and so we built into our daily routine is some reading time, and usually right before bed we'll all kind of hang out in our bed and read together. And so what I've read a number of articles this week. That's usually my time to catch up on reading, and a couple that were really kind of powerful for me. And I'll share them with you, and I'll put the links in the chat box for you to check them out. This first one, Flip the Script on Change. Tom Guskey is a big educational thinker, particularly around grading and assessment. But this article was really kind of fun to think about, because what he talks about in this article is that the way we encourage educators to make change within the profession is totally wrong, right? Like, we've been going about the process incorrectly, and that for many of us, the experiences that we've come across is that, the thinking is, if we engage in professional learning, that's going to lead us to change our practices, which is going to lead to students' learning outcomes changing, right? And then from there, we can move on to making things a little bit better. What Guskey talks about is that initial professional learning isn't really what gets teachers or educators to change their practices. We first have to see the value of something, okay, even before that professional learning, right? Like this idea that, it might seem like a good idea, but if you can't show me that it's going to make a difference for students, then I'm not going to change my practices, right? And so it makes a lot of sense, but it was interesting to read in that the model we subscribe to across all schools and districts is really very different. We tend to assume that just because we provide ourselves with new opportunities to learn, that's going to lead us to change our practices. So it was a good read. It's particularly short, only a couple pages, but well worth the read and reflection. And so I'm going to pop that into the chat for you too. All right, so Flip the Script, it's called.
Heavy jacket.
Is it? I think so. I think so. It is. Hold on, everybody. It's 45 degrees. So yes, you'll need one. All right. So my kids are going outside. It's like outdoor time for them. So checking in on what the temperature was. I'm going to close this window. So this was also a great article too. And this comes, by the way, from the magazine is The Learning Professional. The organization Learning Forward, which is an educational organization. This is their monthly periodical. So the article is Teaching Without Fear. And what the article talks a little bit about is, we're very, and rightly so, focused on psychological safety for our students and for our families during this time. And what we also have to think a little bit about is psychological safety for our teachers, right? And for our educators, not just during our time of closure, but also like under normal circumstances. And if we don't have cultures and communities where educators can feel psychologically safe, then we can't expect people to make any change to their practice. And so James Martin is the author. It's a great article, and Martin is going to join us for one of our PL on the Go sessions, not next week, but the week after, to talk a little bit about developing psychological safety and how schools and districts can do that effectively for their educational staff. So that we're excited about that. And this was a great read too. So I'll give you the link for that in the chat box. Okay, so this one is Teaching Without Fear. So this article here from the New York Times was an interesting read. As I mentioned, as you just heard, in my house currently, I've got a 10, she'll be 10 next week. I've got a 6-year-old, and then my wife is a 3rd grade teacher in Chappaqua. And so there are times of the day where we're literally all trying to do various forms of schoolwork. And, I like to say that from like 9 to 12 in our house is basically like a nightmare at this point, because there's talking, there's questions, we're trying to manage those types of things. And so this was kind of an interesting article to read, just about helping to think about, and primarily, for those of you who have younger kids, to think a little bit about how to set some of those boundaries. But two, if you have older kids, or even if, let's say, you and a spouse or a partner are working from home currently, how do you manage that? So at the end of the day, you don't feel like you're ready to like explode, or go somewhere, even though they're right. That's right. Yeah, right. So how do you make sure that you're really good about things? And so this was a good read, and I'll share that too. So, boundaries. Okay, and then lastly, and yeah, let me say, looks like, oh, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so Andrew just wrote in the chat, interesting to think about this idea of teaching without fear during social distancing guidelines, right? And so now it's not just this idea of psychological safety in a normal school environment. It's also, it's what communities are and how they operate is very different. And so one thing I'll say is I'm personally struggling with the lack of face-to-face contact. I mean, face-to-face through Zoom is great. It's awesome to be able to see people, but it's different than standing in the same room, as somebody. On the flip side, I appreciate that through these connections, I've been able to connect with people like John, and John works in my own organization, but I've never had the opportunity to really engage with him before. So there's like that kind of interesting balance. And I've got just 2 more I'm going to share with you, and then I'll turn it over to whoever wants to share. So ASCD is another educational organization. They put out a special report on remote learning and remote teaching. Basically, they have a monthly magazine called Educational Leadership, which is a great go-to for what people are talking about in the education world. But this special report was awesome. It's got a lot of great articles. And so I didn't link to any in particular, but the issue itself has a lot of great articles about ways to think about the work that we're doing. So one's a really kind of nice read on surviving distance learning and some of the elements of that, right? So by Alexis Wiggins, so that was kind of a cool read. And then Leanne Young wrote a nice piece about how do we support our neediest students, and what do accommodations and modifications look like in this environment. And the last piece I'll just mention, at 2 o'clock today, so you see this article, 3 Strategies for Better Online Discussions. Mike Sherry, who's a professor out of University of Central Florida and who has spent a number of years researching how we engage in effective conversations. He wrote an article about a few weeks before we went into kind of closure mode. And so he had done a lot of research on, formulating online discussions, right? How do you really build an online discussion structure? And so he's joining us at 2 p.m. this afternoon to share a little bit of his research. So if you'll be around at 2, if that fits into your schedule, we hope that you'll join us for that. So I'm going to share this article here with you. This is the ASCB special report. And then the last article I've got comes out of Chalkbeat, and Chalkbeat is a educational reporting entity. And so this was kind of an interesting piece. Now that we're 5 weeks out, at least in New York State, people are really starting to talk about like, okay, what happens next? And when we go back, how do we make sure that we recognize kind of what we've gone through and we make adjustments so that we learn from the experience, right? And so Matt Barnum and Kaylin Belsher wrote a little bit about some of what they're seeing from people they've spoken to about how we might readjust our practices, what the future could look like for education after things begin to normalize, we start to get back to things that feel a little more normal. So this is going to be the Chalkbeat article. So those are kind of like my articles to share. The last thing I'm going to mention, just as a book, I started reading this week Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. For me, I'm always really, really interested in trying to further understand perspectives that I don't have. And so being at this point, middle-aged white man, it puts me in a position where a lot is kind of normal for me, right? Like there are elements of our society that are really kind of geared to me and who I am. So it's been an interesting read to help give me some additional perspective that I certainly don't have, and that hopefully will help me better recognize the differences that exist and things I just need to be mindful of, both as a person and as a professional. So that's kind of what I've been looking at the last couple of days, and I'd happily turn it over to anyone who wants to share some of what you've been thinking about reading-wise. We've got 13 people here, so it's a small enough group where if you just want to pop on and unmute your mic and share some of what you've been looking at, reading, thinking about reading, happy to take it. And if you've got things pulled up and you want to share what's on your screen, we can turn it over to you to do that as well. So feel free to unmute and chime in.
If nobody else is going to chime in, I just wrote down a couple notes of just things that I've been doing. This is also my first time in this group, so I'm happy to know that you're going to bi-weekly, you said, so perhaps the next time I can contribute a little more on the article side. But I just wrote down a few things and I'll just kind of say them. First of all, the news that's really been consuming most of my life is just, how to avoid, what's out there, but really specifically looking for things that tie to education. And I think a lot of like what kind of slips under the radar is like budget cuts and funding for various things. We hear about all of the economic reports and stuff, but that's really going to impact education in a big way. And so that's one thing. I've been reading a lot of children's books for music because one of the things I was able to go to school one day and grab, I had like 10 minutes to run in, grab everything that I could and run back out. But so I grabbed a lot of books because that's a nice way to share literature through the Zoom meetings with my younger kids, especially. I've also been reading really little kids books because I'm expecting a son in August. So we read some books at night to him, some Dr. Seuss books and things like that. But then the last thing, I'm a musician, so I've actually been spending some time reading music, and in a way that kind of like you reread a good book. I've been going through some pieces that I haven't played in a while and remembering what those kind of seem like, and just kind of spending some time doing that as like a relaxation piece to all of this. So those are some things that I just not noted down. I don't have much to share, but I hope that maybe next week I can collect some of those things and present them better.
So thanks, Andrew. And in terms of in terms of the children's books that you've been kind of thinking about for work with your students, are there any that you've come across, been reading that you think are like particularly important reads for kids like this?
Yeah, I mean, I have a stack of them. One in particular that I have really close is this great series, the Little People, Big Dreams. And so this is a book on Ella Fitzgerald, which I think is a really nice way to, show diversity in music, and show just, the way that successful people kind of get to important places is not always an easy road for them. So, but then, I have another book. Actually, I'll show you one more. This is called The Bear and the Piano. And it's a story about a bear who lives in the forest, who learns how to play the piano and goes off to the big city and becomes famous, and thinks that his friends and family have forgotten about him back home. And when he returns, turns out they haven't, and they were just supporting him from distance, which is actually kind of a relevant theme to what we're kind of doing now, is even though we're apart, we're still thinking of each other. And so kind of to give you an idea, there's all sorts of quirky Mozart books and whatever that sometimes I read just for fun, but these in particular have really nice messages.
And Andrew, I might ask too, along those same lines, and then we can open it up to anybody else. In terms of the music pieces you're reviewing, have any kind of hit home? Like, wow, this piece feels kind of much different to me now.
So in particular, this wasn't as enjoying, but I'm doing a lot of like my cello lessons through Zoom. And so I have a couple high school students who I'm teaching the same pieces that I learned in high school, and I'm actually able to go through in an interesting way. It's on the cello, so an interesting way of sort of relearning it as an adult and wishing, oh man, I wish I knew all of this back then. So in particular, the Elgar Cello Concerto, if anybody wants to look that up, is a terrific piece, and that's one of the ones that I'm working on with them. But
Cool.
there are countless examples of, let's see if I have it. The last thing, and then I know other people probably want to talk, but these are the Bach cello suites. And these are a staple that every cellist plays, and probably one of them everybody here would probably recognize one way or another. It's usually like the iTunes top #1 classical song every single day, is the first suite. So some of these are extremely challenging, and it's just kind of fun to play them with nobody else listening, because they're not really performance ready, a lot of them. So
Right. Well, thank you,
yeah.
Andrew. And what district do you work for, Andrew?
Scarsdale, and I teach
Scarsdale.
I teach elementary music. So
Perfect. Thank you.
yeah.
So others who want to share? Yeah, John.
Well, I'm not a reader, and that's how, unfortunately, hate to start out, but I don't enjoy reading per se, to pick up a book and read.
Sure.
But I read bits and pieces of different things. I'm one that's visual, and I love watching TV, movies, things like that, getting out there in nature. But what Andrew was talking about with the grandkids now, Andrew, and that's why I gave you for your child coming along soon, is that I find myself reading young kids' books or my wife, and just being participant in that. And there's a lot of fun with it. And it's interesting how it engages them. You know, even if at first they don't start out because they're running around. The guy is, let's see, Ethan's 4.5, and the little one's a year and 2 months now. You know, but yesterday on the news, Channel 4, and oh God, where did it go? I had it here. I wanted to show Andrew. There was a gentleman that was on. There he is. If you could see it, I actually took a picture of it for my daughter. Okay. And it's called Rockness. If you go online, Rockness Music. And the guy does some stuff on Facebook, and he left the business world and he's been doing this. I did not go on myself, but it looked really interesting to use with the kids. So I was in you talking about music and, you know, trying to look at books and music as a means of reading. I just thought that might be interesting for you. And for me, with the high schoolers at a alternative high school, there's a lot of reading, especially being I'm in an English class with my co-teacher. So it makes things interesting because he loves to read. And like I'm always telling him, slow down a little bit, buddy. So it's almost like he's teaching me again. And the kids go, yeah, Mr. C, he's got to slow down.
You know, one of the things I think that's awesome, right? A commonality between music and books, right, is that both tell stories, right? And I think that story connection is so important to life, right? So, you know, John, you were talking about the visual component of a great movie, right? And I'm a movie person myself. I saw this past weekend 1917, which was fantastic, right? And an unbelievable look at the First World War. But movies, books, music, all tell a story. And I think particularly at times where we're under stress or there are significant changes, regardless of what venue works best for us, finding ways to immerse ourselves in stories is really powerful, right? So yeah, that's kind of an important piece. So thanks for that. Other books to share, reads or articles too, if you've come across something either in the paper, online, on TV, that that you thought was really powerful, that something that made you reflect. Yeah, Michelle, I saw that you unmuted. What's on your mind? All right, Michelle, if you change your mind, let us know. Hey, Anne Marie.
I reading a book called The Shadows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. If you're not familiar with it, he basically, the main thrust of the book is Google and the internet making us stupid? Is it making us think more than deep things? And the book is totally expected. It's really a historical and scientific mix of how different tools over the course of history have changed how we think. So he goes all the way back to the alphabet, to the written word, the clock, and what our brains are capable of doing. And I was really surprised because I didn't realize that Socrates had this whole theory that writing things down was going to make people dumb, that he really believed that you should memorize everything. And that was proof that you knew it if you could memorize it and recite it and answer questions about it, of course. But Plato believed that the written word was going to extend people's capabilities and free their mind from having to memorize. So your mind would be open to other things. And then, it goes on to talk about how your brain works, like the neurotransmitters and synapse connections and what builds memory. And he also finds that, like Google, for example, Google searches don't allow people to make long lasting memories because they don't need to. You don't need to really have a deep understanding of something you Google, because you Google it, you know it's there, you move on. So that's where he kind of says shallow version of knowledge now, as opposed to in-depth knowledge on certain things. So anyway, it's very interesting. And I actually started reading it a few months ago, but I just picked it up. I mean, I'm trying to cycle between some nonfiction and fiction in these last couple of weeks. So
Sounds like a really interesting book.
I recommend it. It's it's The Shallows, Nicholas Carr. He's not a scientist. He's a journalist, which I think makes it a little bit more accessible, because he's able to explain the science and the history to lay people like me. So
Cool. Thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. One thing that I appreciate is, and I shared this a couple weeks ago when we had this first session. I just finished a book called "You're Not Listening," and it was a great read. Kate Murphy is the name of the author. Like Carr, Murphy is a journalist, right? So she's writing about, and what the book is really about is how to better cultivate your listening skills. And it's an element of work that I often think about, and how to be a better listener. And so what I appreciated was she came at it from a journalist's perspective, not as somebody who's a scientist, not as somebody who's an educator, as somebody who interviews people for a living and who does a pretty darn good job of it. So it was kind of fun to read from that perspective, because it provided a different sense of things than I get from the normal books that I might read. So, and this sounds very much like a similar piece to take. And I love the fact that, it's also all about perspective, right? And, it's hard to imagine thinking that writing things down would make people less intelligent, right? But it's totally understandable that when you live in like your own frame, your own element of time, right, that you could have thoughts like that, right? So it gives you a little bit of pause to think about, well, maybe we have to be kind of open to some of the changes that our children and our students are experiencing, and figure out how we help them to utilize those tools in an effective way, and not bemoan the fact that they are using them.
right. I mean, I was a social studies teacher, taught history 11th and 12th grade, and over the course of 15 years of teaching, I noticed that it was harder and harder to assign kids just read these chapters. You can't, now it has to be more scaffolded. The readings are shorter. My English teacher colleagues tell me that it's impossible to assign a longer, in-depth novel because the kids really don't have the level of focus that they used to have to be able to read that. And also, they also have all these distractions when they're home and not able to really sit and read and process. So I was interested in that, but then reading this book, I'm thinking, well, their lives are so different now compared to the schooling that I had. Maybe they don't need to have those skills. Like, maybe that's no longer where our civilization is going. So it made me rethink. And I think because he's a journalist, like you said, he's able to work out the argument through his book. So I thought that was really, it was really interesting. It definitely made me think a lot about what kids are doing. And also it makes me think about even being in this online environment. I've gotten a lot of articles and so forth online that have all of these hypertexts. So even if you read the New York Times online now, you have all these like blue underlined phrases and things. So if you keep clicking on those, it will take you to this article and that article and this fact and this graph. And you're kind of like, all over the place. And then I have to kind of think back to, wait, what was the original article again? Where did this come from? So you're taking on this journey through hyperlinks, like all over the place. You really have to be able to focus yourself either to not read the hyperlinks until you finish the article, or keep track of where your train of thought is going. So these are ways that I never had to think when I was, in high school and college, because nothing I read was hyperlinked. So.
Such a great point. Yeah, it is a different time. And I think books like that help us remember that, our perspective makes us who we are. So being open to remembering that others have different experiences is really important.
I wanted to chime in, just a thought I had, a personal reflection is I kind of felt that way about math when I was like in, elementary school and probably my entire life, is why can't I use the calculator? Like, I have this calculator here that will give me the answers. Why can't I use that? And to looking back, it's like the stuff I remember the most is the stuff that I did with the pen and paper or the pencil probably. And I didn't use the calculator when it got to the point where I was just plugging in stuff, more probably high school math. I don't really remember a lot of that, but, simpler stuff where I really wanted to use the calculator. So I wonder if that goes to your theory of like having the technology, we don't really remember things. We just kind of rely on it to get the answers for us. But.
Thank you. It's a great point, Andrew. Yeah, it's right. The using tools so that they support us rather than enabling us in some level, right? And making sure that that we can really learn from the tools that we have access to. So thanks for that. Others who want to share, I'd love to hear from LL or Yanira or Vicky.
Hello, I'm LL. Hi, I'm Lorraine. I work over in Pinesbridge.
Oh, hey, Lorraine.
Hi, nice to meet you. I guess all I really want to share is that during this time, I try to listen to the news as least as possible. I'm trying to put a lot of positive stuff into my brain. I think that's so important during this time. And, not to get into religion or anything, but, I'll read my Bible, the Psalms, things that make me feel comforted inside. And I think that's really important for our minds right now, to know that it's not all bad. Even though it's bad, it's not all bad. There are some things that can comfort us, and we could get through the day a lot easier that way. So that's really all I wanted to share.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm glad that you're here.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, John. There you go.
Spacebar wasn't working. Lorraine, it's poignant what you say about jumping back into religion and the Bible and everything. Not that I'm reading the Bible right now, but I certainly have been doing a bit more or a lot more of praying or just reaching out to, different mediums. For me, it's watching TV, a mass on TV or some kind of religious site and stories and things like that. And, it's something I've always felt it was in this spot, but now it's more moving this way, so.
That's great to hear. Yeah. Because it's times like this when we realize, there is a higher power.
Yeah.
We need hope. We need all that. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thanks, John. Others, hi, Vicky. How are you? Anybody else want to chime in with things that are on your nightstand that you're reading that you're looking forward to diving into, either to take your mind off some of what's going on or to help you kind of begin to think about things a little bit differently? Yeah, Vicky. Oh, you're muted though. Yeah.
I'm very much like John. I'm not a reader, but I do like comforting books to read. So I go into the Bible like Lorraine does. And that is how I get my comfort, I guess.
Sure.
Watch videos or movies is better for me. I
Yeah.
get understanding that way. When I read, I get lost. It's too much. It's overwhelming for me. If anybody has a suggestion as to what to do with that, that would be great. You know, I would love to read, but I just can't get it focused.
Yeah. Yeah, that part can be hard. I think for me, what ends up happening is I lose my focus fairly easily, and what I'm doing, Vicky, is I end up sometimes reading multiple things, right? Like I jump around from a book to an article and then to another book, and so then I get very confused. You know, it's like,
Me too.
you know, so I'm with you. I think that, and this, you know, I'm just speaking for myself. Part of it is, I think, the quicker pace to everything that we now are living in, right? I can think even 20 years ago, I could take a book, sit with it for an hour, and feel like, you know, that's all I needed to do. But now, you know, I'll get a notification on my phone, you know, or that. So I think I'm much more distractible actually now than I was, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? So for me, that's what it is. And I think I'm seeing the effects of that on my own behaviors and habits.
Yes, I agree. I do too.
I know, Vicky, one of the things with me, and part of why I've made the excuse that I don't read, is because I read slower and I start to almost build a video or pictures in my brain of what's going on. So that becomes distracting.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I agree.
So we've got, and I apologize if I don't have the names right. I see a Minal, I see Naheem, I see Maritza, Yanira, Nada, and Shakor. And I don't know if anybody wants to chime in who hasn't had the chance to chat yet about books that have captured their thinking or articles they've come across. You know, what we want to give you a chance to chime in if anything's on your mind. Hey, Maritza. So one thing is, you know, if we've kind of shared and if people were here to be listeners, that's great too. You know, our sessions can be as long or as short as they need to. So what we'll do is we'll close down our session for today. No worries, Maritza. You know, if there's anything, Maritza just wrote that her mic doesn't work very well, and that's cool too. So if there is something that you're reading or you've found that you've come across, feel free to pop it into the chat, and you can add it there. But this is, as I mentioned, a bi-weekly learning opportunity. We alternate it with a writing workshop. You know, so for those of you who like to read and write, we alternate this session with a session where we take some time to write together and engage in some writing prompts as a reflective exercise. My background before my current role was in science, but I've been a writer and a reader for my whole life. So it's something that gives me the chance to connect with people as well. So we'll end a little bit early and give everyone a little bit of time to go about your business. For those of you who are, oh, and Maritza says she's reading My Sister's Keeper by Jody. Oh, nice. For those who are planning on coming back from Mike Sherry, that'll start at 2:00, and you can access the link to that session in our PL on the Go placemat, and I'm going to post it in the chat box so you have it. sorry about that. We update these sessions every week, and so our next list of sessions will be available probably, if not this afternoon, this weekend. So here's the link to our placemat for the rest of today. In fact, I think our next session is our last session for the week, but we have a number of great sessions coming up next week as well that we hope you'll join us for. And if you're interested in talking about tips to kind of strengthen online conversations, open up the link I just sent. You'll see Mike Sherry's box, and you can click to join that call, and that'll start in about 15 minutes. So I want to wish everybody a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
See you later.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, everybody.